Joe Bojo. I'm the director of the space you're in, the Capgemini Applied Innovation Exchange. Just by show of hands, how many of you are first-timers to what's now San Francisco? All right, so about half and half. Well, welcome, and for those of you that are returning, thank you for choosing to spend some time with us tonight. Let me give you a little bit of context in the nature of the building you're in and a little bit about who I am, what we do in this space. So you're in the Capgemini Applied Innovation Exchange, and we're Capgemini, a French-based consultancy based in Paris. We've been in operation here for about a year and a half, probably coming up on 2 years now. We host about 200 clients a year here, mostly corporates, and they come to this area. We have 11 of these around the world. They come into our facilities with a range of different business challenges that they're struggling with, and we work to help them to discover the innovations that are in this geography and the digital landscape and help them to apply those innovations at scale for their business. So we look forward to talking to you more about the space during the evening session. So one of the interesting things that we did today, we launched a new program beginning last week where we have a residency program where our clients co-locate with us. In this case, a great French bank, Crédit Agricole, will be placing 2 people with us to endeavor into the valley and begin to innovate in this area. So we're happy to have them with us tonight. The format for this evening is we're going to have a great conversation with Vivienne, and Pete, our partner from Reinvent, will facilitate the conversation. Going to be an incredible discussion. I had a chance to talk to Vivienne a bit earlier and absolutely fascinated with the subject matter for this evening. Around 8 o'clock, we're going to open our garage door right over there, and we have some food trucks coming in. So look forward to continuing the great conversation after Vivienne and getting to know you all a little bit better. So with that, let me hand the evening over to Pete, who will talk us through the next steps.
Thank you, Joe. Well, as Joe mentioned, we're about a year and a half into this series, and it's been so successful that we're actually expanding it to New York. And in October, we've got What's Now New York opening down in Chelsea, right off Union Square there. And it's interesting, as we kind of came into New York and we've been laying the groundwork for this, we're starting literally October 30th. Stephen Johnson, who did one of them here, some of those of you remember that here, he did one earlier here, and he has a house in the Bay Area, so he's officially a Bay Area person. He also has a house in Brooklyn, so he's actually a local in New York. And he's going to kick off this series out there comparing the 2 innovation hubs, what's similar, what's different, what's synergistic, what's not. And it's going to be a really interesting kind of event there. And we're actually going to ask all you folks, anyone who has interesting characters in their network that they think would love the New York version of this, we're happy to pick that up, and we'll talk a little bit at the end of the evening for that. But here's the deal, is when we're going into New York, the New Yorkers are kind of a little bit, hey, a little put off on the San Francisco crew coming into their turf, and they're saying, well, what's different about this What's Now? And so it really forces us to think about what is it that really has made this really work. And there's several pieces of the formula, and for those that don't know What's Now, it might be helpful here, but even folks who have been to more of these, because it's actually sharpened our sense of what is really going on here that's different. Now, the basics is that every month we go to a different area that is really just kind of throbbing with innovation in the Bay Area. We find some remarkable person in that space that can actually come and explain to audiences outside that field what's really most important that's going under development there. That really matters, something that everyone should be starting to tune into. They're also talking about what's happening now. It's what's now San Francisco, right? They're talking about the latest thinking, the latest developments, not their polished canned talk that they can go talk about later. It's things that are not even in the news yet often. It's what the questions they're grappling with now, their colleagues and others in that field are really kind of wrestling with. That's what makes one piece of it special. The second piece is, it's you folks. This is an invite-only crowd we over time of selecting for innovative folks from all kinds of different fields. And as we have gone systematically through these different fields of AI and clean energy and now we're in neuroscience and biotech and all the different spaces, we're kind of collecting a network of networks of very interesting characters. And we really do believe that it's this mashup of different fields and insights from different perspectives that really makes for more fundamental innovation. The third piece of it that's different is we only fit so many people in here, but we really think we need to open these big ideas up. And so we always do video, 3 camera shoot, get it out to folks, do a high edit, and squeeze down the essence of what happens here into social media and other kind of forms to really spread these ideas around. Now, that alone would be an interesting series. But what I think has really made this thing interesting and even more special, this is what we're trying to explain to the New Yorkers, is that these folks, everyone we've had in here, both the speakers and actually the people in the audience, are not just interested in what's going on in that field for innovation's sake or making money in business. They're in there to actually figure out how can what's happening in this field contribute to some kind of larger, more positive impact on society. How can we actually leverage what we're learning here, what we're developing in these applied technologies to actually literally make a better world? It's a huge motivator for everyone who comes into this space, and it's really animated all these conversations. So over the course of this series, we've just watched all the pieces of the puzzles kind of get teased out in all these different fields about how in aggregate we're starting to actually watch a kind of meta-innovation, a fundamental reinvention of what's happening in this area here, but our larger society, politics, economy, however you want to think about it. Now, tonight is no different. Tonight is no different. In fact, it's exactly right on point. Because tonight we're going to focus on neuroscience. And not just neuroscience, the ideas of how the brain works and what we know about how the brain works, but how we apply what the brain works, applied neuroscience. And in this field, we're very, very fortunate to have Vivienne Ming with us tonight. Now, Vivienne is a theoretical neuroscientist. She actually started really going deeply into this at Carnegie Mellon. She's actually done advanced work here at the UC Berkeley, be tied in there. So she totally gets the state of where the science is. But she's also an entrepreneur. She's in fact founded her 4th company recently here, Sokos. These are always applying what she's learning into kind of applicable companies, things that actually make this stuff happen. And so we actually have someone who's both understands where the science is, understands what's possible, and the third piece is she really cares super deeply about what these insights and what these technologies can be used for to really make a bigger impact on the world. She's completely motivated by if we can figure out, understand the brain, if we can build a better brain, if we can enhance the brain, we can actually enhance our learning, we can enhance how we work, we can enhance the human potential of all individuals. And that has been motivating her work. It is constantly what she's kind of pulling up here in her thinking, and she's going to really help us think about that tonight. And as a final little piece of this, her own story is one of a personal transformation, which we're going to talk about a little bit here, and it's completely apropos to this story about maximizing human potential. And so with that, I think we should have her up here, and let's start our conversation for tonight.
All right. At some point, I won't be cold anymore.
It's about as hot as San Francisco gets, actually. What can you do?
I want my 106 Fahrenheit back. I don't know what happened there, but it was a good thing, at least for a moment.
It's so great to have you here. So what I think would be helpful for the crowd, and there are definitely people from the field in here, and there's people outside the field, but I think what would be helpful to us is when we go back to when you really started getting deep into the neuroscience, Carnegie Mellon, kind of 2000-ish, if I recall. Mm-hmm. Tell us, where was the state of the science there and that kind of, and just give us a sense so that we can look at how far it's come and how quickly it's come to compare it later. But just where was it then when you really started getting your head into it?
Well, you know, it's an interesting field because it's had these little jumps throughout. So when I was starting, actually at UC San Diego, originally with Terry Sinofsky's, if anyone knows him, this giant operation he runs, the Salk Institute, UC San Diego, big major player across all these spaces. So, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but my goal in entering my undergrad was simply, what could I study that would have a meaningful positive impact on the world, in a snobby technical sense? And so I literally flipped a coin between the cognitive science department, the first in the world at UC San Diego, and the economics department there. And the coin came up heads, so neuroscience it was. And and I was introduced. I took my first classes in this space, and it wasn't just the brain. I was introduced to machine learning and natural computation, as it's sometimes called, and trying to understand the brain through studying machines and studying machines through the brain. In fact, the recent Apple announcement, all of that face technology, that was my undergraduate lab. They spun off as a startup, and last year they did real-time expression recognition analysis of one of the Republican presidential debates. Literally the next day, the bidding war started between Facebook and Apple. Obviously, Apple won, so now Siri understands the human weakness of love. But in some ways you probably don't think of that as applied neuroscience, but we were studying how people perceived faces, how we understand emotion, how machines could understand emotion. To me, it was just about mashing up what machines were best at and what humans were best at. And I got hooked. If I'd gone in, I thought I was going to be a wet neuroscientist at that point, and I was introduced to this field called theoretical neuroscience, where you could be incredibly lazy, and you didn't have to stick wires in anything or screw around with rabies retrovirus or any of that stuff that real neuroscientists do. And instead, you could just take these theoretical models and trace them out and see where they went. So that was one of the starting points. But the other was a video I saw right around this exact time in something called BrainGate. And go Google it right now, because you can see these videos. My favorite, I have two favorites. One was this guy, he's getting brought in. I think if I recall correctly, he'd broken his neck in a motorcycle accident, profoundly paralyzed, hadn't moved his body in 6 years. And obviously, none of what was about to happen should come as a surprise. They're wheeling him in. He's got this big box glued to the top of his head. It's full of a bunch of electrodes that are down into his motor cortex. And they wheel him in, and they show him this screen. And there's a big blocky cursor on it, like it's an old VIC-20 or something. And they simply say, how many people got that reference? They simply said, imagine you're moving, I'm not that old anymore, imagine you're moving this cursor around. And he's like, what are you talking about? And they said, imagine you're moving your hand. And suddenly the cursor starts shaking, and then it starts moving in the circle, and this guy's saying, holy shit, because this is the first thing outside of his face he's moved in 6 years. So that, in a way, was the genuinely exciting state of the world in, let's say, 2000, where we had entered into this amazing new space of motor neuroprosthetics, where you could wire someone's motor cortex directly into a cursor, into a robotic limb. At the World Cup, if you watched closely, you saw someone kick. In fact, the opening kick for the whole thing was someone who was profoundly paralyzed from Nicholas Logothetis' lab at kicking the ball using an exoskeleton driven by his motor cortex. I mean, this was amazing what could be done. But what I started immediately thinking was, where are the cognitive neuroprosthetics? What could we do with something that's even more deeply us? And I'll be really blunt, taking it beyond medical treatments, beyond some of the most obvious cases, which are totally justifiable places to start, Alzheimer's and autism and traumatic brain injury, and really saying, as it said on my website since virtually the day I started at UC San Diego, what if it was 20 plus or minus 2? So definite bonus points to anyone that got that reference. But this is a famous paper from the 50s, the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. It was about working memory span and how much stuff we can remember at any given time. It's a reason why there are certain numbers and phone numbers and things like this. And the specifics don't matter. What really matters is that plus or minus 2 point. This idea that some of us have a slight advantage and some of us are at a slight disadvantage.
Meaning we could hold, some of us can hold 7 numbers at a time, some can go up, some can go down.
Yeah, and again, needless to say, in the 70-year sense, it's become a much richer story, but there's still this variance in the population. And, imagine if you're 9, that is strongly associated with living longer, with stronger social connections, with better education outcomes, with more wealth and more income. And if you're a 5, wow, that is something that doesn't bar you from doing anything in your life, but it does make everything harder. And I was just always taken with this idea of what if we could shift that up? What if we could actively go in and kick that up for everyone? And before I finish my opening spiel here, it's worth noting that we do this actively in the other direction for hundreds of millions of kids around the world. Because one thing we've learned in applied neuroscience is childhood social isolation, childhood household stress, lack of rich adult-like communication with your children causally decreases. We know at a molecular level how these causally decrease cognitive ability. So we allow people to push this in the other direction. I would love if someone stepped up and tried to push back and push that number up. And, to be provocative, what if it were 20 plus or minus 2? And this one dimension of what it is to be kind of smart, the most astounding person you will ever meet that is neurotypical is probably in the low teens. So
Meaning, okay, so explain that a little bit more. So what you're saying is if the average person could actually, let's say, in a practical sense, for people to understand that, can hold 7 numbers at the same time.
Yeah.
Harder to hold 9. The most brilliant people can hold up to low teens, 14 or something like that. And that's the limits of the best humans.
And you start to push out, and that may not sound like very much, but these are the same sort of neural systems that subserve imagination and the complexity of an argument you can follow, your ability to attend to multiple events at one time. So in that sense, it's not shocking that it's so closely related to all of these important life outcomes. So there's all sorts of abilities and that's why I'm saying it's a much more complicated story than this original one. So the idea was brought up as this chunking. So famously, there was this guy who was actually studied at Carnegie Mellon by a number of groups there, and he could remember thousands of numbers. And what he did, it turned out he was a runner, really into long-distance running. And he would see strings of numbers, and he'd think, that was the winning time of the 1963 New York Marathon. And he'd be able to chunk these long strings of numbers into something that was much more resonant with him. So there's all sorts of strategies and mnemonics one can use and change this experience out. But I'm sort of talking about what's the raw horsepower we have available and what happens when those numbers change dramatically.
Okay, so what you've kind of laid out is a field that one side of understanding how the brain works is how do you extend the neurons into physical attributes, prosthetics. But you're trying to say there's another side of the field that's just how do you take the brain and enhance it, make it better, improve its capability, regardless of the physical connection.
I would hazard to speak potentially for any fellow neuroscientists here that whenever you write an NIH grant claiming you're going to treat some disorder, what you're really thinking is, and wouldn't it be cool if we could use this on healthy people to make them smarter and happier? And in an intent to be provocative, what if you could have like an app that had a bunch of sliders on it? And it said openness and conscientiousness and attention. And you could just kind of push it around and be the person you want to be. Now, clearly, that is so vastly far beyond anything we could possibly do right now, or maybe you even truly would want to do. But in some sense, that's what so many of us working in education, which is another field I work in workforce development, we're exactly trying to push those sliders around. In everyone, but through this long, slow process of slowly adjusting your brain. And it's at least intriguing to think that we can short-circuit this in a wide variety of ways. And I know we'll have a chance to go through some examples here, but there's an amazing body of work right here in the Bay Area.
Okay, so you kind of seen the roots of the field. We got to this space here. What is the most exciting developments that are kind of breaking out now, and particularly with roots in the Bay Area, that you think really have huge promise, actually?
So in some ways, some of the things I'm most excited about are kind of infrastructural. So the well-informed of you have probably heard of neural dust. This is little nanomachines being developed by a research group at UC Berkeley, Jose Carmina and a variety of others, looking at can we create these little things on the scale of single nerve fibers and get them to go in, and it's very cool. They're both powered and read out by sound. So you drive them by playing sort of hypersonic signals into the brain, and they can then read the individual activity of these nerve fibers. So again, taking it beyond, it is where it is right now, and there are published papers on being able to read out from rats here. But the vision is, right now, we can do some fairly amazing things, let's say with functional magnetic resonance imaging, putting someone in a scanner, or putting someone in a really complete EEG or MEG, the sort of brainwave concept. And let's say Dolby, actually, here in San Francisco, is doing these analyses. You're watching a show, like, what is that gut-wrenching, like, bass drop in, your favorite movie? How is that changing your perception? And they're looking at that in your head. There's a group at UC Berkeley, actually, that spun off a startup specifically looking at neuroadvertising and how we respond at a deep neural level to some of these things. And they actually ended up getting purchased by Nielsen to sort of look at how this stuff plays out. But I think the coolest space is thinking about how we extend this out. So the big challenge technically in this field has been, how do we actually have chronic recording? When you put wires in the brain, you damage the cells, you create scarring, the cells move around, they're shifting, there's all sorts of problems. So how can we get around that? Elon Musk quoted some research by saying, well, we could inject these things venously. So instead of having to deal with getting through the skull and the blood-brain barrier, maybe we could just make the recordings through the sort of arterial structure of your brain, just like that. There's another great one where there's these injectable, expandable nets. So you can inject this flexible sort of metal-like substance, and then it unfolds itself across the surface of the cortex. And the initial findings from that work is you don't see the scarring, you're able to get fine detailed interactions with those cells. The nanotech approach with neural dust, and then one of my last favorites is chronically implanted chips, but in this case with sort of steerable magnetointerference across all of them. So the chips themselves aren't wire-driven, they aren't directly connecting with the cells, but rather they're reading out, it's almost like having a bidirectional MEG, but chronically implanted in your brain, so you don't have these sort of physical connections.
So we're essentially getting closer to getting a brain-machine interface that would be not intrusive and would be effective to kind of get out the brain signals into machines, essentially.
You'd have to be wildly optimistic to volunteer to be a subject for this kind of research anytime soon.
Are there anybody who wants to volunteer?
There's always someone that wants to volunteer. But if you are profoundly paralyzed and someone's making a promise, hey, you can drive your wheelchair, not with intense concentration. One of the things I loved about the BrainGate work was you just imagine you were moving your own limbs. And when you look at people, Shinoy Lab at Stanford and Carmina Lab at UC Berkeley, you see people that are leveraging this sort of level of transparency where it isn't hard work. I know for a lot of us, we think you take the latest emotive mobile EEG rig or Neuroscience or any of these other groups, not Muse, and maybe somehow you'll think really hard and you'll drive these. And I think these kind of mobile technologies really genuinely will be the solution someday. But right now, you want the naturalness and the automaticity of driving your car, where, for half of us, probably we get to where we're going and we think, God, I don't remember anything about driving here. That naturalness in moving your own body, but replicated out here. So technically, this is what I'm excited about. But actually, we could open this way up. It isn't just about what we might really traditionally think of applied neuroscience. First work I did here was with cochlear implants. So this is along with deep brain stimulation, this is sort of the only really genuine, out in the market neuroprosthetic. And it's kind of been there since the 1960s. Just essentially wire a hearing aid directly to your auditory nerve, your eighth cranial nerve. And if you do that in a little kid, particularly in a baby, they'll grow up and they'll hear the world. And that's controversial in the deaf community, but it is a profound transformation of what that child can do. Now, you do that for someone my age or older, and they may well turn it off afterwards. So we said, well, what if we could improve the algorithms? What if we could make cochlear implants that actually learned themselves? This is a dirty secret in the sort of neuroprosthetics world, but it's an extremely lazy endeavor to date, which is to say, you just pretty much just jam some wires in and let the brain figure it out. And what's amazing is it will. So we're talking about these motor neuroprosthetics, but if you plug this into your motor cortex, right next to it, just across this little divide, is where we sense our body, our proprioceptive systems. So at least in rats, go back and wire a feedback loop into that system. And you don't even have to be that accurate. Just kind of get it in the right area, and the brain will figure it out. And you can create full proprioceptive feedback where you actually feel like you're moving your own limb, or at least that's the interpretation of the rat. We'll have to have a discussion with it later after we make it super intelligent.
Okay, so there's this, just to get we're going to get the train here so that we can have an interaction, a conversation with everyone. So there's the techie kind of connect to machine thing, but then there's the insights to how brains work that we can apply to making people better learners, better workers, and enhancing human potential. Tell us the state of the art right now in that space, which is not so much about the technology per se, but by the insights into how the brain works.
So here I'll be very selfish. I'm going to talk about a couple of my own projects. So we already started off with working memory, so I don't have to explain that space anymore. There's actually some great work, a working paper that just came out of Adam Ghazali's lab here at UCSF. Famously a developer of NeuroRacer, which is this incredible piece of applied technology. What they found is, and this is getting very geeky, that if you look at coupling between, I think, frontal theta and parietal gamma, this is actually strongly not only is it predictive of working memory and multitasking capability, but then they looked and they did something called electrical transcranial stimulation. So they give this phasic stream into the frontal lobes, fixed to that same coupling that I just described. Don't worry about the technical details if you're not following it. It's not meant to be followed. What's fascinating is, in fact, it improves working memory and multitasking capabilities. Now, I'm excited about this, and in fact, I'm now advising a company that is building a set of headgear to do this. It has the EEG, it has the stimulation system built right into it, it has a swing mic and earphones. Why does it have that full set? If you want to go out and get VC funding in applied neuroscience, and the discovery you found is we could knock up your working memory span by maybe 1 or 2 points, you know where you go sell that? Professional gamers in China and Japan. Every dream you ever had of curing traumatic brain injury, if it's not money from NIH, you go where you've got a market. And it may sound crazy, but from the day I showed up at UC San Diego, people have been building applied neuroscience technology for gamers because they will pay for any advantage. But there's a fascinating question there. What does it mean, actually, if someone wears this chronically, and we chronically, artificially drive the coupling between these two regions? I can see theoretical answers in both directions. Does it improve your natural working memory span, or does it make it worse? I have this strong belief that technology should challenge you. And in the case of neuroprosthetics, you can really clearly articulate that. Yes, of course, I should be better when it's turned off, but I should be better than where I started when I turn it back off. I should be better when it's turned off, but I should be better when it's turned off. And I think I've this strong belief that technology should challenge you. In the case of neuroprosthetics, you can really clearly articulate that. Yes, of course, I should be better when it's turned off, but I should be better than where I started when I turn it back off. So when I turn it on, my working memory expands, but when I turn it off again, I should actually have some residual benefit. It should never be doing what I can do for me. It should be challenging me. It should be making me better. So this is another project. This never went beyond the prototype stage, but the ideas were so cool. And this truly is in the sort of therapeutic prosthetic domain. Imagine you've got an early stage Alzheimer's diagnosis, and you're staring at that first time that you don't recognize your own child. So now I'm going to expand the notion of what applied neuroscience is. This isn't just about implanting technology in your brain. So imagine what we're doing is we've got something equivalent to Google Glass. We've got an EEG. What we're looking at is to build a model of who you are, what your emotional reactions are. We've got heart rate, maybe GSR, galvanic skin response. We're building a model of you. Maybe not a super rich one, but a basic one. All those faces, who are they? Who do I recognize? And each one of these technologies, by the way, I'm pulling off the shelf. Nothing new invented in this, just putting them together. And one of the cool things we found is you can get those signals of that memory failure. That moment you walk in and we know you're not going to recognize your child. And it doesn't require us to do transcranial magnetic stimulation or some incredibly complicated feedback loop. In fact, just flash the name on the screen before they actually experience the failure. And it turns out the response is that the failure, in essence, doesn't happen, at least not at a subjective level. So this is kind of freeing us up. This is where I was, in fact, when I left grad school and founded my first company, which was an ed tech company, where I said, listen, I love this. I think in 20 to 30 years, this is going to change the definition of what it means to be human. But 20 to 30 years is a long time. What could we take from applied neuroscience right now and deliver into education, deliver into workforce development, where we're not sticking wires in people's heads, at least no time soon, but we can actually use what we know about how the brain works and maybe even some recordings to make a change. Here's an even bigger split. I had a company, and we were building sort of market research tools to track emotion in real time. You didn't do anything, you just carried your phone around with you. And you might think, how can you figure out how people are feeling? But we actually found that the way people move through space, once we had a basic model of them, its changes in how they move through space became very predictive about mood transitions and different emotional states they were in. And it was nice. We built the system out. We got to validate it against a large number of users. But in asking me to join their board, I said, I'm happy to help you build this stuff, but give me all of your data. I want to predict manic episodes in bipolar sufferers. So bipolar disorder is famous. If you ever saw the show Homeland, you saw the main character experiencing the sort of wild manic highs and depressive crashes that are characteristic. You know, neuropsychology is not my field. I certainly have had those classes here and there, but I didn't know anything in detail about it before this company sort of asked me to join their board. And I thought, well, this sounds like it has some real potential. So the amazing sort of really serendipitous moment came that same day when one of the employees said, I overheard you. I have bipolar. You can use my data. And what we found was that we could get strong signal in a sort of abstract, probabilistic sense, strong signal of an incipient manic episode 3 to 4 weeks before that person's subjective experience, before they could report for themselves. And it may seem wild, but there's this wonderful literature that plays out where they were taking people with genetic predispositions, family histories of bipolar disorder into the lab and running them through these very invasive tests and finding, in fact, that they could see 6 to 8 weeks ahead of their very first ever episode. Evidence of cognitive changes, of sleep changes. Well, if you might imagine, you know, how you move through space, this is just the simplest example. If we're tracking your phone all the time, we can do a pretty good job of picking up when we start to see sleep disturbances early on in this process. for half of sufferers, there's no real effective treatment. Lithium and other, in fact, there's only papers published just last year explaining why it didn't work in half of sufferers. So it's a disease where 20% of sufferers will go on to kill themselves, of severe sufferers will go on to kill themselves. What might it mean if you knew weeks ahead of time that there was a problem oncoming, and if the drugs didn't work for you, or if famously the drug effects were so sort of corrosive in your life that you frequently were going off of them, what could you do? And it's interesting because no one knows, right? We haven't been there before, where we could, weeks ahead of time, try and intervene. One of the important things about this system was we built it so that it sent out text messages to pre-identified trusted confidants. Somewhat famously with bipolar, when you go in the manic episode, everything's great. Who would want to take drugs? So, your sister, your doctor, your best friend, let them know ahead of time. This person who volunteered their data, drugs didn't work for them. Their solution was to lock themselves in their bedroom and have their loved ones take turns keeping an eye on them until they were safe to go out again. So, this is the idea of the sorts of things we can build and inject and transform people's lives.
Okay, so there's those disorders in it, and that's fantastic to kind of help folks like that. But let's move it then to, I was struck by, we had a little conversation before, and you said, well, if we can build better brains, we can make better learners, we can make better workers. Like, once we start taking it away from solving problems,
medical
issues, where is that going? And again, it doesn't even have to be what's exactly happening now, but where's the promise of that? I mean, if we're having a trouble, let's say, transitioning the American workforce into a different kind of economy, I mean, is there things that we're learning that we could actually accelerate?
Yes, we borg them all out and just make them do what we want them to. Believe me, my impression is there are some people that are, that's a great idea. So here's an example of a piece of work I'm doing there. If you're curious of the specific names of any of these companies, come talk to me afterwards. But I'm part of this group that's looking at creating neurofeedback technologies for high-performance teams. So what are we cobbling together there? Well, what do we know is diagnostics of a truly high-performance team inside of a company? Psychological trust, strong communication ability. Flip side that not a lot of people think of, but comes out of the behavioral economics and sort of neuroeconomics literature, is the ability to be skeptical. It turns out if I put together a team of people that are really similar to one another, it's almost like we've had a little stroke. We're not appropriately skeptical of people that are like us. By the way, leaders have this stroke for the rest of their life. So any CEOs in the room, you're diagnosable. So what we're building is a system that looks for the neural signatures, and they're there, of psychological trust. We're looking at things like temporal lobe synchrony to pick up on strong. So this is one of these almost spooky findings. When two people are engaged in a really rich discourse with one another, our auditory regions, which are obviously strongly related to our language regions, can actually begin to sync up with one another. And does that sound like it's some sort of weird brain reading thing going on? No, it's the way I interpret that is just, I have a model of you, you have a model of me. If those models are really accurate in terms of our interaction, and speech has all of these complex rhythmic patterns, then you would expect those to be in sync with one another. In fact, my original work with that was in little kids and looking at how this kind of synchrony, when they're having discussions with their parents, actually evidenced better linguistic development. So their verbal fluency and all these sorts of things. And it turns out it was a strong one. So, and then the final one is some great work by people like Rick Montague and others, where in fact you can see the neural signature of bubble-type investing behavior, exactly that sort of weird lack of skepticism. So when the markets are running high and everyone's going into the frenzy, are we seeing activity from your nucleus accumbens, which essentially is the same as taking hits of coke, or are we seeing activity in your anterior cingulate? That's a complicated structure that has different functional regions, but he found, in fact, when you could differentiate the activity across these two regions and look at the neural signatures there, and work both in fMRI and then we're now working in the EG space, you can actually see. And so what we're doing is we're actually working with the woman who led the DARPA team to build a neurofeedback training system for snipers. Now, that may not sound great to everyone in the room, but as a domain, train people up. It turns out it takes several months to take someone from beginner to essentially asymptotic proficiency as a sniper. So they built this system, and by neurofeedback, I don't mean like, you chant to yourself or something, but rather you make it transparent to the person. They can actually see what parts of their brain are active and what's in sync. There's some great work by Moran Cerf and others in related spaces. So they were able to turn it from months to days. So people reach proficiency on the sniper range within days because all of these subtle things that we really can't introspect on, we can't just open ourselves up and see, they made transparent. And then these people, so what we're testing right now is this idea, what if we did it synchronously for whole teams at the same time and gave them the feedback, right? And we could see what actions, make it transparent. What are the actions you're taking that are actually driving the development of trust in another person? Did this other person really understand what you were saying? Not at a semantic level, we're not analyzing that, but are we seeing the evidence that in fact the two of you were in a rich discourse? And then finally, are we really preserving the appropriate degree of skepticism? We have this amazing potential to take incredibly creatively, cognitively diverse teams and bring them together, but their number one problem is, if you're really diverse, is kind of metaphorically, maybe literally, you don't speak the same language. It takes a lot of time. Most companies aren't willing to invest in that. If we can take the highest performance teams and bring them up to top performance and shorten that investment time, then we can really tackle some of these problems.
So this is maybe a time, because we're going to start moving at some point here to the interaction with everyone here. But what I'm hearing here is the incredible plasticity of the brain, and also the incredible potential of really hitting much higher levels of performance or insight or brain capacity. And I think it might be interesting to kind of shift to your own story, because you kind of have kind of gone through your own changes in a way that actually have kind of are in some ways a testament to that kind of ability to kind of go from...
Sure, there's even, I suppose, in a broad sense, an applied neuroscience story here also. But to flesh out that story at UC San Diego. So I was first at UC San Diego in 1989, and I promptly flunked out. That tends to happen when you never go to class. I kept paying my tuition, though. That was smart. And really, anyone could have predicted it based on how my life had been going in high school up to that point. I was a pretty miserable kid. And in fact, I spent a good chunk in the mid-90s living in my car, homeless. And it was miserable. I'm not saying to shed a chair. I had a pretty good life. I just kind of squandered it because I couldn't figure out any way to be happy. I couldn't figure out any way to be meaningful. And I really just gave up and ended up with kind of a night with a gun and a decision. And that decision was, I don't understand myself. I'm not something on which I can make a decision. So I'm a geek. I was a geek back then. I need an objective function. Live a life that makes other people's lives better. If I need to make a decision about what to do, it isn't about whether it's going to make me happy. It isn't about whether it's going to make me successful. Live a life that makes other people's lives better. And it took a long time to dig myself out of that hole that I put myself in. But 10 years later, it brought me back to UC San Diego. I'd saved up enough money. I had a chance to go back. I don't know why. When I flipped that coin, what I was actually choosing was, which degree can I finish in a single year? So it was math, economics, and cognitive neuroscience. For reasons that no longer make sense to me, I thought, math, what am I ever going to do with that? So I flipped a coin between economics and snobby. Obviously, I've left literature and other things on, which I now say in retrospect was wrong, given my own research. But this is where I was, and I finished my entire undergraduate degree in a single year. I got nearly perfect scores in every class. I went on to Carnegie Mellon from there. I got to do these incredible things and published fancy papers. And it turned out I was still miserable. But I found someone who loved me. My work was taking off. Everything was good. So imagine how stupid it was when almost 10 years to the day, with the gun and the decision, I then turned to my then fiance and said, "You want to know my deep, dark secret?" I said, "I wish I were a woman." And I don't know, shit happened, and here I am. So it's, don't go tell someone you love something if you don't want it to come true. So she was amazing, and even though I meant nothing by it whatsoever, she helped to make it happen. And the interesting thing about that is twofold. One, the big change moment wasn't the gender transition. It was 10 years before that when I realized I needed a purpose that was bigger than me. And in fact, a lot of research has shown, and what we now call computational social science is really quantifying that a purpose is a huge predictor of life outcomes. The way I look at it is the gender change, the career, the happiness that I never thought I was going to have, those were all the gifts for doing the right thing. The applied neuroscience side of it, estrogen is the best stuff ever. It is, I don't know if everyone's going to immediately rush out and take my advice on this, but here's my criteria. As a neuroscientist, I have some pretty strong opinions about all complex human behavior, gender and gender identity being one of them. My professional opinion doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is this person better? Are they a better person for having made that change in their life? And I would challenge anyone that can at least for a moment set aside whatever their religious feelings are about it and look at me and say, honestly, that I'm not a better person in every single way than I was before, leaving aside push-ups and peeing standing up, which are, the latter is the only thing guys really have an advantage in life. So it's, and it genuinely, it is amazingly liberating in terms of what you're able to accomplish in your life when you make that sort of change. And I don't mean gender transition, but when you make that change that you recognize, don't do it to be happy. Just understand that that's one of the things that comes when you're doing it right. And yes, if I could build a little button that you could push on your app, you know, to make you happy, I'd at least be willing to think about it if it passed my challenge test, which is you're better afterwards. You're not just drugged up, sort of the rat that starves to death, stimulating its nucleus accumbens over and over again. But if this is something that can make someone's life better, all I care about is that you're a better person that's affecting the world.
That's quite a story. Well, we're going to be turning any minute here, but I just, given your own story and how you've kind of evolved and your own insight into where neuroscience is going, when you look at the next 10 or 20 years of this field and what people can do and the human potential of all these individuals, but also of our society, are you optimistic about where we're going? I mean, are you filled with confidence that we're going to make something better here, or are you really worried about some of the dangers of all these same exact technologies that you've been talking about a little bit here?
I think what's important is to be rational. I see all sorts of things to be excited about, all sorts of things. I mean, I wouldn't build this stuff if I didn't think it could make the world better. I'm a huge sci-fi fan, and when I read novels like The Diamond Age, to me, that is an instruction manual to go build something.
It's Neil Stephenson's
yes,
favorite book,
you know, every time I come across something like that, to me it is Well, how would you do that? How could you build a little AI book that's designed specifically to optimize a kid's life? And that was my first company, was to try and do exactly that. And then you learn, oh, it turns out that there are these challenges with just trying to optimize a bunch of grades. So why don't we take a different approach and optimize long-term life outcomes? But it's always kind of inspired by this idea that people truly could be better. And if you so here is the good and bad side. Gallup, very roughly speaking, in this famous report said there's about 130 million people worldwide that are like deeply engaged in their work. Well, that's kind of a rounding error in the global population. That actually sounds kind of scary to me, that there are so few people that are really part of the creative process of changing this world. Now, the flip side of that isn't, goddamn you 8 billion people that aren't contributing. It's how have we convinced ourselves that we can just ignore everyone else? And I love this idea from Elon Musk. I want to die on Mars and not on impact. But that's not going to be on the back of 1.5% of the creative potential of this planet. We leave so many people behind. And right now we're doing education work in South Africa and in India and here in the United States. I think China, particularly Western China, has an incredible emerging problem there that they're aware of and beginning to deal with. But we see this all over the world, where the vast majority of people, our solution is, let me get provocative. There was a recent announcement, I think just earlier this week, that Accenture and Google and Facebook and Salesforce pumping in tens of millions, altogether $300 million, I believe, to a White House-sponsored initiative to train kids in programming, essentially, in K-12 computer science. And I appreciate the spirit of it. But who said we need programmers 20 years from now? I'd be shocked. It's also getting the causal model wrong. We here in the Bay Area love programmers because they solve these amazing problems in high-valued spaces. Well, guess what? It isn't because they know how to program. It's because they're creative, adaptive problem solvers. And if you came from my generation or later, or if you're a freak like Vint Cerf earlier, then you went out and you learned how to program because this was an amazing tool to affect the world. If we just go force people to program, there's no high quality jobs waiting for them. In fact, that job market's going to get smaller and smaller over time as more of it gets automated. So to me, I want to build I want to build explorers. I want to build troublemakers. I want to build all of the sorts of things into people that I can never build into machines. At least nothing we know how to do yet. And we are not doing that right now. And in that sense, I'm both scared and bullish. There's so much. Forget the delusion. We're not bringing 100% of the global population along with us. But we're starting so small. Imagine a world in which 10% of us had the chance to meaningfully contribute to where our civilization is going, or 20%. That would be, I don't think we can. I don't know what that world would be like. But let me tell you, the flip side is there isn't going to be much of a place for anyone that isn't contributing at that level. And I think this takes a real change in how we think about building people. The solution here isn't jamming wires in people's heads, but studying the neuroscience of this, what we see is what's predictive of life outcomes is we can actually go in and we can change the way these kids think. We can change the way the workforce interacts with the space around it. We can change their brains. That's the way I think about workforce development, about education. It's not whether you can answer questions on a test. It's not about your scores or your annual 360. It is the opportunity to change people's brains and make them ready for a world that is explicitly about change and uncertainty.
That was a perfect time. Fantastic. Clearly that is resonating, and it's also clearly time to to move to your guys' questions. I mean, I've asked enough here to kind of lay the groundwork out. But I see David Duncan in the back here, who is well versed in the fields of bioscience and neuroscience. David, do you want to stand up and introduce yourself, but also ask your question?
No, sure. Thank you, Peter. And fabulous. That was
Thank you.
really wonderful. And no, I just write about this stuff, so write articles and all of that. But I'm curious. I want to follow up on what you were just talking about, because I think this is so important. It's partly, you're talking about expanding people's minds, improving it 20% or 30% or something like that. But I wonder, first of all, who gets that? And will everyone even want it? And so that's a couple kind of questions, but leading up more to, are we going to be having a group of people, and I think this is already happening in a sense, that want that will jump in, that will make it happen, and they'll talk to people like you and others, and we begin to have this divide in society. And that's already happening on a number of different levels, but it's I love what you're saying, and I hope it happens, but I also wonder if we're going to be enhancing that divide.
Yeah, so there are whole conferences on neuroethics and the ethics of applied neuroscience and in a variety of spaces. And in some ways, unsurprisingly, the questions floating around there are very similar to the questions of ethics in technology in general. So to get right at the heart of this, one of the reasons, even though I sort of stepped away from being a workaday scientist and became an entrepreneur, is to do this much more applied work. This is the one area where I've remained with this toehold, is partly because I know other people are developing this. And I know that one of the main areas, not to be overly provocative here, but one of the main areas of funding is military, both DARPA and Chinese military and others. And, I think it's important that we all have something of a say in how these things develop out. To me, this needs to be, so my point being, to some degree, this is one of those classic technologies that's going to happen. It's going to hit us at some point. I don't know when general artificial intelligence is coming down the pipeline, because I think we need a whole new set of technologies to be invented there. But I believe it's possible, but I don't know when. But there's a very natural progression from what we're doing now to learning more and more and becoming more applied. As I frequently joke, neuroscience has been a fairly slow process for a very long time. Just wait till customer support and customer service gets involved, and now the feedback loops will really start speeding up. So to me, this needs to be a human right. If we want it, it needs to be a human right in the sense of vaccines and others, which is a choice people can make. Your point, though, about if this follows any rational economic model, then how smart your kids are will be a function of how wealthy you are. And that's already true, right? In some really profound ways. Well, just imagine that turned up a couple of orders of magnitude. I don't know what an AI singularity might look like. That's kind of the whole point of the concept of a singularity. But this is one that, what if we split in, again, this is the sci-fi in me talking, but what if we split into a society in which one half of us kind of very rationally looks at the other half of us like we're down sufferers. We just can't keep up. And I would hate for that to be the future of humanity. So, the idealist in me, the utopian in me, is constantly in conflict with the realist. So I'm scared, and I'm endlessly intrigued at the same time. What I want to do, the reason I go out and talk about this stuff, which is still probably, except for some very immediate things like deep brain stimulation, retinal implants, things like that, probably still real decades away from truly being an everyday part of life, is because the choices we make now will carry through in how these things get applied more broadly. And my yammering on about it hopefully means that a room full of people will be involved in those choices.
Here's one here. Let's just see the hands up on folks, just so I know. Okay, we got a bunch, but right
All
here,
right,
Jeremy.
I gotta do
right there.
quicker
Yep.
answers.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Jeremy Sherman. You talk about a brain-machine interface. What's your short version of the distinction between a brain and a machine?
Oh, gosh. So one of the interesting things about my alma mater is we have a class called distributed cognition. And in that way of looking at the world, there isn't really a hard distinction, right? Who we are is not just a function of our central nervous system or our cortex. It's a function of our bodies. It's a function of my smartphone. I'm a little dumber because it's in another room right now. Sure as hell means I don't know anyone's name here. Pete. So this is not one of my strengths, and it's vastly enhanced. You know, when I used to wear Google Glass all the time, which is a whole other story, it was kind of amazing to be able, I had my hands deep mashing up plantain, and I was about to go wash them off so I could go look up the carbs. My son's a type 1 diabetic. And I just thought, hey, Google, how many carbs are in?
Different question.
Okay.
I'm asking, is the brain
Well, get-
basically a complex machine?
Oh, sure. The heart of that is there something more to the brain than is in the most complex machine? And I guess there could be, but I've never seen any evidence of it. No one in a scientific context has ever seen any evidence of that. So, there's bigger metaphysical questions about what goes on, but if you wanted me to give you a hard, short answer, yes, a brain is a machine. Clearly, we're not a von Neumann computer, but we are a computing system. And I think there's a strong interface between artificial and natural computer systems that we can exploit.
Okay, we're over here.
Hi, my name is Morgan Matthews. I work at N-Square, a nuclear weapons risk innovation fund, so I'm totally not a neuroscientist, but I have a two-for question. First,
Can you speak a little louder?
Yes, you mentioned DARPA and the sniper experiment. I'm wondering if you're referring to the TCD, the transcranial direct stimulation piece of that, and I want to know what you think about that technology, because it seems like it hit a dead end. First question. The second question kind of goes to this metaphysical aspect. Like Robert Sapolsky is a neuroendocrinologist who believes there's no free will because we're just biological elements stacked upon each other, and a lot of that happens in the womb, that development, and so we have no free will, and I want to know what your thoughts are on that. Thanks.
Okay. So quick, easy. So the first one, yes, this sort of feedback loop system does involve transcranial. There are different types of stimulations that are exempt. So there's magnetic stimulation, there's direct current stimulation, there's alternating currents. So there's all sorts of ways that I might kind of excite your cells and change their excitability potential or directly stimulate them. And they have different effects. If you'd asked me 10 years about that stuff, where you just take a big paddle that induces a big current and you put it near there, I'd say, you're going to kill yourself. You're going to shut off your pawns, and then that's going to be it. And then the FDA is going to crack down on this stuff. And it turns out it's a lot more interesting space than I gave it credit for way back when. It's much more precise. The fact that you can do these really phasic linked loops it makes it genuinely exciting. I don't think we actually have a deep understanding of the phasic nature of the brain. So we talk about these couplings between gamma and delta in different brain regions. And some people say working memory is this power range and this coupling. I don't find that to be a good understanding of computationally what's actually going on in the brain. But nonetheless, I think it speaks for itself. The ability of these systems to actually have been shown to improve performance and outcomes kind of speaks for itself. So it's much more exciting than I originally gave it credit for. As far as the free will goes, I would love to make a dismissive gesture and say, so we do or we don't, what does that change anything about how we approach the world? Turns out a paper just came out showing that as you adjusted people's perception of their free will, it actually adjusts their choices. Given the findings in that paper, yes, we have free will. So run with that.
My name is Henry Poole. I'm touched by your heart, your courage, and your.
All right, I don't need to start crying up here in front of the crowd.
your intellect, of course, and your commitment to other people.
Thank you.
And this is kind of an ethical question because you're lit when you talk about it. But I'm curious if I was a young man or woman curious about neuroscience or about this field, where could I go to work, or what communities could I get involved in where I would be assured that my work would contribute to the public good?
So, despite going to the dark side, I'm still a huge believer in the power of academia. And right here in the Bay Area, there are amazing labs doing this work. And even if I don't believe it about anyone, but if somehow you believe that you're not measuring up to earn a PhD and become a professor and start your own lab, those labs still need people. They need people to volunteer. They need people to support them. They need people to actually go out and help them achieve the things that they're building. I hope no one thinks that that's all they're worth. My wife taught me this. She now runs research for the San Francisco school system. We were both, she was at the ed school at UC Berkeley. If you don't believe that people can change, you should not be a teacher, period. I fundamentally believe people can change, and in profound ways. So I hope all of us have the chance. I mean, all the stuff I'm talking about, I've done since I was 30, and all the good stuff where I was able to smile about it since I'm 35. So, there isn't a point. You can ruin your life, and guess what? You get to start all over again and do good work. So that's one. Another is, I love the hacker communities in this space.
I'm a software developer, and I'm one of the 130 million people that really loves my work, right?
It's terrific.
And I think that people that work with their heart love their work, and we ignore the story that human beings are just in it for themselves, because some people are actually really want to be in it for the public good, right? As a software developer, I found free software, open source, but really copy left. Are there any communities in your field that bring that kind of discipline to the intellectual property?
So there's been a big push for an open data initiative in neuroscience for a long time. This is hard in science where tradition has all of the credit goes to the person who publishes the paper. And as one of my former professors said, I will happily share my data when I have wrung every possible publishable paper out of it, and it's 10 years have passed. So, but there are people trying to do this, and so I come back to the hacker community, people that are publishing on archive, people that are getting out through open press, and making that stuff work. This is the thing about neuroprosthetics research is you've got people that are theoreticians like me, but we need biophysicists, we need engineers, we need software engineers. This is a big, complex space. God forbid anyone have to actually run a system based on code I wrote. You should never have your brain running on scientist code. So there are some emerging communities. At the moment, I'm going to blank on the names because I'm terrible with names of all kinds. But for example, one of my companies down in Santa Barbara is called SmartStones. They pinged me. They said, hey, we need some engineers because we're taking the system we built for avocal kids and we want to translate it into EEGs for people that are locked in so they can talk. And they're making some amazing progress here. They actually just won the Roddenberry Award. And it was great, science fiction, science. And we put them on, there are these groups out there of neuroengineers out looking for jobs, looking for open source projects, looking for hacker groups to contribute to. Track me down afterwards if I can use my artificial brain to enhance this answer. Those groups do exist, but it's not just the nature of the dynamics of science haven't been quite as accepting. But let's say, at the Redwood Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at UC Berkeley, which is where I've been a visiting scholar now for a while, is that's where a lot of for the Pythonistas in the room, that's where IPython gets developed. A lot of the work in that space comes out of that group and the broader group at Berkeley. So there's this tight interconnection between people working in the open source world and working in the neurosciences. Massive data sets and the problem of making sense of them. They go really well together.
Sorry, if you could stand up. And others who have questions, just get your hands up. So I'm just trying to understand. Okay.
Hello, my name is Skye Schulte, and I work with Ogilvy, and I'm looking through the world through a behavior science lens. And I want to go back to the discussion that was started around better brains, better learners, better workers.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about your thoughts around Howard Gardner's sort of theory of multiple intelligences, and sort of the idea that our traditional scholarly sort of educational system only really focuses on a few of those. And I'm interested in terms of the application of that, especially to some of the work you've done for teams and how we can better create teams that will really be the workforce of the future.
Yeah. So, all right. So there's two answers: the immediate answer about Gardner, and then a broader answer about different kinds of intelligence. So Howard himself has subsequently apologized. He says, "Hey, it doesn't really look like there are kinds of intelligence." So it's. Like a lot of these stories, it turns out it's more complex. I think there was a lot of very top-down, I would like this to be true, and we're seeing it emerging. When you look at the history of how some of these ideas developed, then you can kind of see it's more about the person than the science. So there's this emerging area. My wife and I wrote a review paper about it. Here we're kind of agnostic. We don't care what kind of constructs go into this space. We only care about two things. I'm a scientist. Which are these constructs changeable about a person? And two, are they strongly predictive and in some cases demonstrably causally related to long-term life outcomes? In my work, both in education and in workforce, we track 45 such constructs. It's largely arbitrary. I just got kind of tired of adding new ones. Some of them clearly have relationships with one another. In some ways, mindset and grit and motivation are not fully independent concepts, but they are independently defined in the literature. On the other hand, way over, we have working memory span, self-assessment from the metacognition space. So there's all these different constructs that, at least at some point in your life, can be fundamentally changed and are meaningfully predictive, and again, in some cases, demonstrably causally related to long-term outcomes. So there's a great paper just came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science a few months ago, looking at 8,500 senior citizens in the UK and how 5 of these constructs, as they increased in the population, every imaginable life outcome improved. Greater income, greater wealth, greater social connectivity. It's interesting how that went from a predictor to now it's such a good thing that we just assume everyone should have it. I don't. Multiple biomarkers of positive outcomes, including some congenital ones. Isn't that interesting? Who you are affects what sort of things your body will express even when you've got a genetic trigger for it. Subjective happiness, everything you could want in the broad sense of a life goes up when these qualities are there. And the finding in that paper could just be correlational, but the nature of our work is looking broadly across the amazing work with Carol Dweck publishing on mindset and Angela Duckworth publishing on grit, which is not a great intervenable construct, but it is a popular one. And each of these, and showing, wow, every single one of these is changeable. Some of the really deeply cognitive ones, maybe only for the first few years of your life, but they're all changeable. So in that sense, are there multiple intelligences? I don't know, there's maybe 45, maybe there's a smaller dimensionality to this space, or maybe it's bigger than that. I'm not so obsessed with that. What I am interested in is, could we take a 5-year-old and change those qualities about them? Or better yet, can we create, I don't care about artificial intelligence, can we create augmented intelligence? Could we empower their parents or their grandparents or whoever their caregivers are to make that change in their kids? So in that sense, I deeply believe it. And I just got done talking to a bunch of HR leaders at a Fortune 50 HR conference, and I said, everything you're doing right now in hiring is wrong, which they already get it, right? Everyone's desperate for a different way of doing this. You're wasting your time interviewing people for qualities when you know the interviews aren't predictive and the qualities you're looking for, so they know how to program. Again, is that predictive of how good they'll be on the job? These things are predictive. In my own work on analysis of 122 million people, but the cool thing isn't just that they're predictive. The answer to that problem isn't, what's the right profile I should look for? The cool thing is that they're changeable. That no matter where you find someone in their development, there's something you could do as an employer that would actually make them even better. So one of the cool things I get to do now is be a mad scientist. I get to work with a lot of giant companies around the world, and ironically, I've even worked with the Joint Chiefs of Staff on questions about this, not recently. And it's hard not to feel a little hurt, and I get to do these crazy things. What if we could, we brought this idea up the last time I was sitting here. What if we could define a concept like employee lifetime value? But then instead of treating it like a static thing, we could tell you, hey, if you could invest in this person in this way, if you could give them these assignments, if you could give them these people to work with, and that's the way I think about changing the brain naturalistically, here's the person they could be. Here's how they could be contributing to your company. And yes, there's this even madder scientist part of me that wants to experiment on orphans and live in a castle, that does genuinely want to stick wires in people, or something like that. But you don't have to do that. I mean, there's so much more low-hanging fruit that's out there in our schools, at home, in the workplace, that we just aren't doing right now. And it's not magic, but it's taken time to sort of get to a space where we could really say something like, how do you quantify purpose? And then transmit that as a cultural ideal in your company. And by that, I don't mean our company has a purpose and everyone aligns around it. How do you build people that can construct their own purpose? That's what you actually want. So that was a little idealistic, but it is aligned with the sort of spirit of the question.
All right, we don't want to keep people too long from those food trucks that are lining up out there, but there are a few more questions we'll take. Here's one. We'll get one to hear him.
My name is Nafiri.
Oh,
okay, it's on. So I like your story about you created a model for a person with bipolar disease.
Yeah.
And obviously creating a model of an individual can provide rich data. But you can also argue that everyone is different. So long-term vision, or long-term in the future, I can see companies wanting to mass produce using this data, but how can it be mass produced? How can you, and should it, or should it?
Yeah, so I've had the chance to work on a couple of different health tech projects. The only thing that they have in common is that we just give them away afterwards. So in this particular case, is very similar to the rest of them, which is there's a starting point for being able to essentially to educate my dumb ass. I don't know anything about I mean, maybe I know more than the average person, but I'm not a neuropsychologist. So what do I know about this disorder? Let's collect the data. Let's see what's actually there. I went and I read a huge number of papers. We start to synthesize these two together. Start looking at features from a data side that are predictive of behavioral transitions that we actually expect in an informed, educated sense. So we weren't really building a system unique to this one person. And in fact, here is kind of a depressing side note to this story. Like I said, the actual purpose of the company was market research. You know, if you're Qantas, wouldn't it be great to know how someone was feeling before they got on your plane, how they were feeling for the seemingly 87 hours it takes to fly from New Zealand to anywhere, and then how do they feel afterwards? And wouldn't that be a powerful thing to know? So in our case, so we have this rich data set that we get to look at, and we did some projects, for example, with the MTA, where we had all this data. And what we could see was, admittedly, this is unvalidated, but I will go out on a limb here, clear evidence of people that were in the midst of manic episodes. And we couldn't do anything about it. right? We didn't have any permissions to intervene on them. They were part of market research. They were not a part of a health intervention. So the one thing I can say is actually, and we see the same thing in my education work, our goal is not to treat, we don't do health interventions like autism and things like that, but I will tell you, when you start to get into that data, you clearly see evidence of kids that are going to get diagnosed at some point. And you can't do anything about it. And it's kind of heartbreaking. When my son, before he got diagnosed, I must have searched on Google 100 times about bedwetting. Now, in retrospect, I know, hey, that's one of the most classic symptoms of a young kid with type 1 diabetes. They're just trying to stay alive. It's the only way their body can get rid of the extra sugar that's building up inside them. I yelled at him. You know, this poor kid that's just trying to stay alive. But I will say this, without rancor towards Google, in some sense, they knew. They could have let me know. So your neuroethic response is, yeah, but what if you're wrong? Can you give the parents this response if they're wrong? Well, how about a proportional response? Google controls my news feed. What if they increased the incidence of news stories I got about diabetes? Just made it a little more salient in my mind. I realize that feels a little bit Big Brother-ish, but I think when a lot of these neuroethical issues come across, and I realize yours is a little more nuanced than that, the response from a lot of companies is, this is very complicated, and it's, you know, we're not going to take a stand. It's not for us to decide for other people. Well, that's an ethical judgment also. That's a judgment that you're actually not going to do anything dressed up in different clothes. And again, the whole reason of talking about this stuff openly, that can kind of sound scary and intrusive, is that I actually really think we should make these explicit choices. And that choice can be, we're not going to use the technology. So I kind of gave the specific to your question short shift. We actually found, generally speaking, that some of these things really generalize well. So in other words, the modeling of my son's diabetes that I did, you know, yes, it was specifically about him, but it turned out that generalized model works really well, and in a bunch of follow-up work at Eli Lilly, they're doing a deep neural network based on similar predictive algorithms, and it actually works better in simulation than a real pancreas. So these things can generalize really well to other people, but it's always worth, you know, the classic machine learning problem, you don't want to overfit the data, you don't want this thing to become very personalized, but if you actually structure your models, forgive the geekiness of this answer, but if you actually structure your models such that you have components that are meant to be personalized and others that are meant to generalize well, you can protect against those sorts of problems pretty well.
Okay, we got one here and then there's one there. And then we're going to end. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Tracy Garza and I'm a neurodiversity advocate. I have a two-part question. First of all, could you tell us, are you neurotypical?
No one that I know would probably say that I am, but so this is before transition.
Could you explain that?
So neurotypical is the sort of offhand language for someone that does not have sort of a standard kind of diagnostic label you might hang on them. So a neurotypical person isn't manic depressive, they aren't autistic, so it's just a generic terminology here. And in some sense, no one's neurotypical, in the same way that we're all very diverse in who we are. But of course, what we really mean is there some strong extreme? So when I was seeking treatment for 20 years of brutal insomnia, I mean, it was so bad that I went and saw a neurologist. And tried various medications and so forth. Her diagnosis is, wow, there's a lot wrong with you, but nothing I can fix. So, you know, it's sort of hard to say, right? I fake it really well, but I'm a social misfit. And so in that sense, I'm a pretty strong outlier. And probably all the more so that I feel comfortable in front of a crowd of 10,000 people, but I feel awkward just wandering, networking at an event like this.
The second part of my question is, over the last 6 or 7 years, there have been a number of studies that show a very substantial overlap between gender diverse individuals and neurodiverse individuals.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows why, but in terms of, like, say, the autistic spectrum disorders, they occur in the community at 10 to 20 times higher rates than the general population. Do you think neuroscience could someday shed some light into this, or alternatively, do you have any personal theories that might guide the thinking academically as to why this occurs?
Yeah, so this will, I don't want this to become an incredibly complicated answer. Listen, if you get into the endocrinology of things like gender diversity, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that these populations are distinct from your average population. So you do see different testosterone and androgen and estrogen type levels in these populations. The other thing is, when I cite this research, it's terrible research. Congress threatened to pull the funding of any lab that did research into transgender populations beyond AIDS research. So no one has really good stuff here. There's a little bit, but I find it a little questionable. But in theory, of course it would make sense that different hormonal expression, the sort of endocrinology of gender must play some role in the way many people end up expressing who they are. I will return to my earlier answer, though, which is, I don't care. If this was 100% my choice, then it was an awesome choice. If this was designed by genetics, if I have no free will and this was going to be inevitably what I decided, if I'm totally wrong about the way the world works and there's a God and this was, I don't care why I or anyone else is. The one thing I do worry about, there was this issue recently came up with the lab at Stanford claiming that they could, with some accuracy, discriminate gay from straight faces. And it got a lot of both press and a lot of people dumped on it. I actually, when I first read the paper, given the fact that I actually do work in exactly that space, building face models and things, I actually thought it was kind of fascinating in the sense that, wow, and some of the very things they were criticized for. Wow, I wonder if there are feedback loops, if people that have certain face shapes actually get more compliments, and maybe there's a cultural drive to sort of being an outlier group if you have a certain face shape. I wonder if people the way they structure their photos and the way they wear makeup adjusts to these dynamic cultural things. So it wasn't so much that people were genetically fixed to be one thing or the other, but it was fascinating just as an idea exploration. And I genuinely got kind of scared when I saw GLAAD calling it junk science. I'm like, my side's calling stuff junk science? I'm not thrilled about that. But at the same time, yeah, I'm worried that if someone like me gets up and says, this is the appropriate abnormal estrogen level at which you should start treating your current son to become your daughter, that someone's going to write a law about that. And that's not how that decision gets made, or should be made, or anything like that. So I'm a little hesitant to make strong public comments, even if I actually have strong beliefs about it.
Wow, okay. One last question, and then we're going to get...
And then it's food.
Thanks. This has been great. Michael McElligott from the Long Now Foundation. Rather than asking you something about your specific research, I'd like to ask you about one of your tools. And this is a little bit different, which is data. So data is going through all of these answers you're doing. And this is really maybe more of a reflective answer. Good data can reduce skepticism, and even the best data may not age well. We may be measuring the wrong things. The science may give us new insights and so forth. I'm curious, as somebody who is looking across all this different research, has experience on the academic side and in the corporate realm, what do you think about our increasing superpower of having this great data, and what blind spots or concerns, or what standards or practices you have to make sure the data you get is good, that it stays good, that you are making the best conclusions going forward?
So I like the way you posed it. Data is this amazing tool. Machine learning is an amazing tool. Our understanding, the neuroengineering, these are amazing tools. In the end, these are human problems, and they have human solutions. It is wonderful that we live in an age in which we have amazing tools, but they don't magically solve these problems. So when I had the chance to debate Ray Kurzweil, I said, listen, you can keep doubling processor speed, but that doesn't make human life better. It's what we do with that processor speed that actually can make a human life better. My biggest compliment I ever received was after that little pseudo debate, and everyone's applauding, and he leans over and he says, "Who the hell are you?" So I have a very complex answer that if you're curious, I'd love to talk about offline here, but it actually comes, in fact, from my work as a theoretical neuroscientist. So we have this idea of naturalistic data, of understanding people out behaving in the real world. Not give them a test, not show them a drifting grading for the neuroscientists in the room, but show them real natural images. So for my work in education, it was, let's put microphones in the classroom with kindergartners. Let's build little bots that listen to college students chat with each other online, and build an AI that will obviate the need for ever giving them a high-stakes test. That data is noisy, it's crappy. Anyone here that's ever worked in speech recognition, imagine a room with 25-year-old kids speaking a mixture of English and Spanish and Spanglish and trying to figure out who's who and attributing. There's all sorts of pitfalls in that. But there is an incredible richness to naturalistic data. And one of the final comments I make that is, if you're an aspiring data scientist or a young person thinking of going into this space, ignore what the data is labeled as. My son's data was labeled as blood glucose level. Blood glucose, it enters your body, and within about 3 hours, it's entirely gone. That's the biophysics of blood glucose. And when we built this AI to monitor my son's diabetes, we saw correlations on the scale of days. Totally, the biophysical label, blood glucose, did no justice to saying, actually, this is an insight into how my son behaves out in the world. When he's feeling that sort of logy low one morning, it turns out the next night, he's more likely to overeat. And our model picked that out. That's why this deep neural network thing at Eli Lilly, it turns out to do better than the pancreas. If you could predict days ahead how you shift around your basal rates and your insulin delivery, imagine what you could do with that. So we take the same approach in education, we take the same approach in workspace. Sometimes this gets really intrusive and is justifiably a little scary in some cases because of that. But the heart of it is, if I want to understand someone, then I want to understand them when they're doing the thing I care about. Why is it we want to probe what a student has learned by taking them completely out of their learning environment and giving them a high-stakes test? Why do we want to understand how our workers are performing by giving them an annual 360? Or, I do think well of it, but Gallup Strength Finders, or some static profile of who they are. How about who they could be, and how we could drive that forward? So data's amazing. There are all sorts of pits and traps. The number one, for my mind, is thinking I can start with the data and I don't need to know anything about the actual human problem. And that is the one thing that I guarantee you will lead to failure.
And with that, let's give her a big hand.